welcome. It's Marcus Timpson here, one of the co-founders of FM Future, who are running the FuturePrint Virtual Summit. Delighted to introduce Mark Hanley for our next session, who is the president of IT Strategies. IT Strategies are one of the foremost sources for insight, trends, and data for growth within the print technology sphere. And Mark's going to take us through a 20-minute presentation here of digital production print markets, financial models for the coronavirus recession. So, Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Marcus. As Marcus just said, I'm going to focus on digital production print markets. What does that mean? That means all the markets in digital print which have gone beyond consumer and office and which have created commercial markets for their form of print, with all those wonderful value propositions which vary by sector that digital is known for, which is very fast response, the ability to do short runs, the ability to vary information, and the ability essentially to integrate to the digital, if you like, information flow, and also the digital physical production workflow. So these are very diverse markets, and what we're going to try and do here is say what we think the foreseeable consequences of the coronavirus recession, as we call it here, could be. Obviously, we don't know very well, much better than those of you listening, but we're going to give you some ideas to chew on, and as things change, we may change our opinions, but I think we all are aware that this is something long-term and serious, and we need to have some basis for modeling. So what are we talking about when I talk about production print markets? We have a list of 15. On the slide after this in a minute, I'll quantify these markets by vendor revenue. So these are the 15 markets which have developed, which have, most of them, an established commercial presence. Some of them are more in the development phase, especially in the packaging areas and some of the industrial markets, but all of them have either a strong commercial footprint or at least have showed themselves to be very credible as future contenders in the print markets. These are very important markets to the vendors who generate the technology because they represent the markets where they can grow. And of course, the consumer and office markets, which are profitable markets for the vendors, nevertheless are in decline because of as a result of secular trends in technology and the way people communicate. In most of these sectors, digital has, in theory at least, a really good long-term prospect. And we'll talk about individual sectors as we go through. The biggest single sector is wide format graphics, which has been around now for 25 years. But we also have a very vibrant document printing sector. We also have a long-established and powerful label sector. In the packaging area, we're at more of an early stage, but interesting early developments. Textiles now well established as well in 3 different ways here. And then we've got a whole selection of other industrial markets. But let me run on to some of the ways we try and focus on these markets in the light of the coronavirus. The coronavirus has shut everything down. It's stopped people going to work. It's causing bankruptcies. It's particularly concerning in the print world, where the world of print providers, whether they're commercial printers, packaging converters, or print service providers, that particular set of channels is especially vulnerable to economic variation. One of the reasons for that is that the print industry in general and the conversion industry tends to be very localized and small scale. Now, it's true, many of the small scale outlets are owned by bigger companies. Nevertheless, economics take place on a localized scale as a general rule in the print industry. This makes it vulnerable to changes in the economy. That's very bad when something like coronavirus comes along, but it's very good to have that structure when you talk about the kind of prices that can be sustained, when you talk about the degree of adaptability to individual circumstances of markets, or when you talk about the sheer fluidity and liquidity of the market. Localism is great then. but it's not good when you get this sort of macroeconomic effect. So on the left-hand side of the chart you're looking at, you can see we've quantified these markets by vendor revenues. Vendor revenues is what the manufacturers of the technology and the systems, the presses, if you like, make from selling the hardware and selling the consumables. Usually consumables is ink, might be toner, and in some cases it includes a big proportion of maintenance fees and costs associated with sustaining new technologies in the market. The total is $13 billion. It's not small. You can see there close to the bottom of the list, wide format graphics, easily the biggest. But you can see at the top as well, the document markets, including inkjet and electrophotography, are well established and strong. In the matrix itself, we've tried across the top to list sector differentiators. So just running briefly through them. Some of these markets are dependent on what we call consumer discretionary markets. So these are things that people like to buy. The output from many of these technologies consumers like to buy because it enhances what they do as commercial businesses themselves, retailers and so on. But a discretionary buy is something that's nice to have, but isn't necessary. In the next column, we talk about things which are necessary. For example, in the supply chain, there we have in the area of continuous feed and cut sheet inkjet printers, we have some green asterisks indicating that in the area of production inkjet, that sector is actually less vulnerable than some other sectors because, for example, continuous feed inkjet supports the issuance of documentation and of transaction documents like billing documents. These are just as important now as they were before coronavirus came, and in some areas there are even new sectors arising as a direct consequence of coronavirus. So typically there we'll see continuous feed inkjet and cut sheet inkjet to some extent favored by current economic circumstances, where document printing over on the left is less favored because it's more discretionary. Then if we move to the next column, we talk about primary consumer necessity. Obviously what comes to mind? Food and beverage. So we see the label markets doing well, and we know this from empirical evidence, talking to print providers and talking to consumers, that there's even been in certain types of products in the food and beverage area actually a spike in growth. So that has a degree of defense in it. So we're talking about here what we call early defense. So at this time, a couple of months into the crisis, we're seeing that these kinds of inkjet products and these kind of label products are not as badly hit, and in some cases are positively benefiting from current circumstances. If we go to the next column along, we come to the issue of high investment. Some of the sectors where digital production printing is prevented involve spending a lot of money on equipment. So if you buy a digital press that prints documents, you're talking about $500,000 and above for that type of equipment. If you talk about continuous feed inkjet products, you're talking there about systems which can cost millions of dollars, and so on through the list. There's a lot of sectors where the investment is still high. This, of course, is hit by the recession. So there are people out there in established markets that have this equipment already, and they're glad to benefit from things like food and beverage and the need for transaction documents, but they can do it on their existing machines. The question is, are they going to buy new machines? That's unknown at this time, and the evidence so far from Q1, and what we suspect the evidence will be from Q2, suggests that some of these markets have actually come to a dead stop. People are not buying new equipment because of the risk. They don't know if they need it, because they have spare capacity on what they already have. So the issue of digital production print technology being expensive, it is not looking good for the next future, let us say. Some of the lower investment technologies, so some of the MFP document printing machines, some of the textile printing machines and dye sublimation, some of the wide format systems, which cost much less. You're talking $10,000 to $20,000 to $30,000. These are less affected, but still affected all the same. The next column over, established market, as opposed to the last column, which is unestablished markets. When you have an established market that's been around for a few years, you're more able to defend. But when you look at, for example, very new areas like corrugated digital print or flexible packaging digital print or some of the industrial markets where there's less of a footprint for digital production print, that's likely to be set back considerably where people are not yet invested in it and they can afford to look at it and say, okay, I'll wait. Whereas if you're in an established market, that's not quite the option you can take. You have to decide, am I going to stay in the market or not? And for the moment, nobody said they're not going to stay in the market. So we've tried to score these by the number of asterisks we give. Red is negative, green is positive, and we've put the summaries on the side. And basically you see there that labels do fairly well. Some of the textile markets don't do well, and in the production apparel markets, for example, we have real issues with very unique types of supply chains going on in Asia, and a certain type of competitive situation that doesn't apply in some of these other markets, which gives that a lot of red points. So we've just put this together as a matrix, a kind of a lens through which you can look at the crisis and judge where you might stand in these different markets. It's obviously quite complex, mixing all these factors together and then the size of the market to decide what it all means for individual markets. Another way of looking at the market, a different matrix, is to look at the macroeconomic factors. So if we look at all our markets and set them against these macro factors across the top, and we look at, for example, one of the big markets driving growth in wide format are the sports industries. Everybody knows sports has come to a dead stop and nobody knows the way forward. That's been a very important sector for the development of some of the more high volume and more lucrative wide format graphics markets. That's a problem. That gets a red star. We look at the next column and we look at retail. Well, wide format graphics as well as quite a lot of document printing in the discretionary areas. These areas have been rather dependent on retail, and retail, certainly looking at it from a US perspective, but I suspect also Europe, we expect retail to be decimated. Retail was already right on the edge and was headed itself for a very difficult situation before coronavirus. Now everything's shut down. I mean, we're beginning to see some really big bankruptcies here in the US. The consequences for the number of people who are going to want the kind of products that digital production print produces in certain sectors, that looks like a very bad situation. And we have to be very concerned about the simple lack of number of people who are going to be in the channel compared to the way they were in 2019. Next column along is the issue of events. Again, a lot of discretionary document printing and wide format graphics printing, somewhat similar to sports, was dependent on events. But here, now we're including conferences, trade shows, and so on. So just the simple demand for that. For example, we've heard that dye sublimation printing for display for trade shows, which are no longer in existence for the moment, has suffered greatly as a result of that. We look across then at entertainment markets, and we look at entertainment at home as well. We see there that some of the textile markets, like direct-to-garment, printing of T-shirts and so on, are not expected to do well as a result of developments there. On the other hand, people entertaining themselves at home more does tend to favor more the adoption of inkjet technology in document. So travel and tourism is down. That's a big hit against textile printing as well. Textile printing has a lot to do with people's activities. If they're not traveling, that's actually an effect there. If we look then at the channels, what we call the decimation of the printers and the converters, and we don't think that's an exaggerated term. We think a big percentage of printers and converters are not going to come out of this crisis. And that's going to affect many sectors for digital print. Where do you actually sell? And are you going to lose 30% of your potential customer base? The answer, unfortunately, is probably that's quite likely. we look at the next column and we look in terms of these macro factors at pharma and medical, for obvious reasons, the pharmaceutical and medical industries are hyperactive, and their needs in turn for documentation and specialist packaging have increased. And when I say specialist packaging and documentation, I'm talking about the ability to customize, the ability to incorporate very new information, the ability to distribute it locally very quickly. These are massive strengths, in theory at least, of digital. But we think digital is beginning to pick up on a lot of that where it already exists. And we also think that long term, this is going to really convince people what the meaning of digital production print over the long term can be. So by the way, we're talking about recession and a lot of bad consequences. Actually, if all of us in this industry can get through the next 3 to 5 years, we are firmly convinced that the net result of the crisis in the mid to long term is going to be the accelerated adoption of production digital print, partly because those who are left in the channel are not going to be interested in buying old technology anymore, and those who survive will be those who modernize, but partly because it's going to make people aware of the tremendous relevance of print where it is needed, and it will make them realize they don't need to print where it is not needed. So this effect will accelerate our industry if you look at this in a 5-year plus perspective. But of course, we have to get through that. So we've actually seen in wide format graphics, one thing in its favor is COVID signage. When you go to a store, which we all have to do from time to time, the need for professionalized signage is only growing from the kind of inkjet devices that are available locally to do it. If we look at issues also like online acquisition and home delivery, we look at the kind of diversified offerings that people are wanting. That's giving a big boost to labels markets right now. And it should give a boost as we go forward to the smaller and less established markets for flexible packaging digital printing and corrugated digital printing. So this whole shift to buying things online and getting things delivered locally, I think most people we talk to think that it's urgent and necessary now, but even when it isn't in the future, people are going to have developed this habit much more and are going to like it. This goes to the benefit of digital. If we look at finally in the last column, construction and industrial investment markets, where we see effects on inkjet CAD printing and on other industrial markets. At the moment, these are macroeconomic areas which are particularly badly hit by the close down. And so we see a lot of industrial applications for inkjet taking a bit of a pause. Anyway, the net result of all this, if you look over on the right at these macroeconomic scores, you can see that most sectors have quite a lot of red scores, but you can see a much more optimistic point of view on the use of production inkjet for document printing and on the use of production digital technology, both in inkjet and electrophotography for labels and in these early markets for packaging. So it's not all doom and gloom, even though the macro environment is very unfavorable right now. There are things really worth fighting for here. So what kind of recession are we going to see? Well, we are asked by our clients, who are the vendors of these technologies, to model this. And we don't know either. Everything's an opinion, okay? But there seems to be a sort of consensus around, is it going to be a V or a U recession? A V recession is a sharp dip. Nobody would argue we've got a sharp dip now, followed by reestablishment of the market. Well, certainly it's a sharp dip. We think it's going to be a very sharp dip. And we've split our statistics here between consumables and hardware acquisitions. We think hardware acquisitions everywhere are going to be much harder hit than consumables for existing technology because the investment is much greater and because there's doubt about the channels even being able to afford this kind of technology for the next period. So we split the two. We do have a recovery. We do think that 2021 will see a recovery, perhaps even beginning in 2020. However, all the indications we see are that it's going to be a modest recovery. So it's not going to get back to 2020 levels. in aggregate, if you add the two lines together, until we get forward to about 2024. If you look at the bar chart below, this chart tells you what percentage in both hardware and consumables, for all the markets together on this slide, what percentage of the end of 2019 market do we reach by 2024? You can see in hardware, we reach revenues that, in our view here, are about 91% of end 2019 numbers, and consumables at about 108%. So altogether, we think it takes, in a moderately middling position view of a V recession, we think it takes about 5 years to get back to where we were just in December of last year. So we don't think that's pessimistic. We think it's realistic. And as I said to you, we think that after this period, the uptake on a larger scale of digital print technology will be faster than it would otherwise have been. But this is looking at the pain we have to go through. We have 5 years to reestablish ourselves. That's our current view. If you were really pessimistic and you looked at a U-shaped recession on this slide, also with a modest recovery, U-shape means that the decline continues after 2020 into 2021. I'm not saying this will happen. It doesn't look particularly likely at this time, but there's such a huge factor of uncertainty, I think it would be foolish not to consider the potential of it. Say, for example, if we had a huge secondary wave at the end of this year or in the fall of the infection and a huge pessimism in consumer feeling, that could be a trigger for a U-shaped recession. This is what it would look like. And if you look at 2024 there, you see that hardware sales only get to 65% of the 2019 position, and they get to just over 100% in consumables. So net, that's a much less favorable position. I suppose you could be even more pessimistic than that. We're not doing that. There are people who talk about L-shaped recessions. That's not what this is. But I think anybody's foolish at a vendor level who isn't looking at the possibility of a U-shaped recession. In the course of getting to 2024, whether we're in a V or a U, a lot of printers are going to die. And we're even going to see vendors going to suffer restructuring to the point where we're not going to see the same population of either companies out there doing what they currently do. And I think we're going to see a lot of the people in companies changing as well, and the roles and functions that the vendors take in the market having to restructure as well. We don't know exactly how it's going to be. We haven't even, by the way, talked about the consequences of there being at the moment no trade shows and no conferences. In our industry, these had a particular importance because you're asking people to buy, in many cases, new technology or technology that is dynamically changing all the time. And in some cases, you're asking them to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions. It seems like the pattern for acquisition is people like to talk to other people about this in person. And the mode for doing that was conferences and trade shows. Somehow that mattered. It's hard to tie down where, but somehow it did. If that isn't there anymore, how do people get to the point of being confident about buying into what is a dynamically changing technology in most cases? That's sort of an unanswered puzzle, and it does look like, you're going to be maybe without trade shows for the rest of this year. And the whole issue of getting people together in large numbers is really an unresolved question. So it behoves the industry to come up with a forum, some way of people being able to communicate about this. If we ever do want to restart these technology sales, somehow it's going to work, but we don't know yet. And of course, as always, you can look upon it as a problem, or you can look upon it as a massive opportunity to recast what a trade show used to do or what a conference used to do. Anyway, we don't have a choice. We'd better find an answer because we don't have trade shows right now. So just running through finally some comments on individual sectors. I'm not going to go through in massive detail. These slides are available to you and you can look at them at your leisure. When we look at the document digital press market, things like Indigos and Zycons and Nexpresses, things like that, we certainly have quite expensive technology here, and so we're trying to expand the position in the commercial print market, which is a weak channel under the current circumstances. So we're a bit conservative about that sector, although we do believe that there's excellent technology that's well established that will take this industry into the future. So we're great believers in it, but it's going to hurt particularly because the technology is rather expensive. It's going to be particularly difficult next period for that. We talked about inkjet document print. Inkjet document print is not the peer of electrophotography in that it doesn't at this point as easily print on coated papers, which are a prime requirement of document printing, as does EP. On the other hand, the inkjet markets have established massively important positions in transaction printing. And transaction printing is favored, if anything, by the current crisis. The extent to which that means people will use their existing machines more or will buy new machines is the unanswered question there. But inkjet production in document certainly not going away. Label market, we talked about that. It's obvious. Retail, pharmaceutical, if anything, it gives a boost. But there's still a question here, as in all the sectors. Do you do that with the equipment you now have, or do you go on to buy new equipment? I think you're more likely to buy new equipment and label, but will it be at the same pace we used to? And what will the cycle be? Will the cycle change? It probably will. We don't know. We look at flexible packaging there. It's a very new market. There is something of a footprint in electrophotography, very little footprint in inkjet. I think that all the things that favor labels favor flexible packaging. So I'm in two minds on this. It's going to pull it up in a way. And in another way, some people are going to say, I'm going to wait because I'm not committed to it yet, so I don't have to at the moment. Some people will say that, but other people will see that as an opportunity to get in there and take share. We look at corrugated. Corrugated has a footprint, not a big one, but it has one, and again, should be favored by the trends towards buying online and getting local delivery. In fact, I'm surprised that hasn't already developed more than it has done. And inkjet has established itself as a good technology in this area. I'd be surprised if in a year or two this doesn't see significant uptick. Textiles in standard die, these are the production roll-to-roll types devices where a lot of the production of apparel is done in Asia these days. There's a channel issue there, and there's competition from China. And on top of all that, apparel is one of those markets that, from what we're hearing, and I'm not putting this forward as a scientific opinion, but what we're hearing is clothing sales have dropped off a cliff. So we're very concerned about the production roll-to-roll textile market. Direct-to-garment, that's a much different industry based on very fragmented local outlets for people to print T-shirts. Will people print T-shirts more to cheer themselves up and to make themselves feel part of the common effort to defeat things? Maybe. Hasn't shown itself yet, but textile direct-to-garment could benefit from that. A little bit the same with dye sublimation, although the dye sublimation market is split between soft signage, which is suffering a big fall because of no events, and on the other hand, apparel, which is also, as I mentioned, fallen off a cliff. But would dye sublimation be in a position to pick up more quickly on people wanting lower cost, new clothing printed to cheer themselves up? Would that take up more quickly on the standard roll-to-roll market? Possibly. We don't know. That's a pure speculation. Right now, it's not looking good. And finally, wide format graphics. Basically, wide format graphics is a very strategic function in the consumer economy. It's not going to go away. It will reestablish. But in the immediate sense, retail is under massive pressure, economically and physically. And so wide format graphics is going to be an early suffering position, but it definitely is going to come back, even if it's gradual, and it still performs and will continue to perform strategic function in the industry.
Mark, we're running a bit short on time now. So just roughly speaking, so ceramics, you've said, is going to be an early recovery, and other industrial markets, is industrial just going to become potentially accelerated given the changes in the manufacturing supply chains necessary?
Accelerated in the mid to long.
Yeah.
term. In the short term, industrial is very diverse markets and not a big footprint, so it would be easy for people to say, I'll wait. But maybe they won't in some cases, so we're not sure.